This is Dr. Jason Remenick, CEO and founder of Thalamus, and you're listening to Thalamus Grand Rounds, the premier podcast built by Graduate Medical Education for Graduate Medical Education. Whether a program coordinator, program director, GME administrator, DIO, or applicant, join me and my guests as we discuss hot topics in innovation in the residency and fellowship recruitment process. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Thalamus Grand Rounds. Today I'm speaking with Lori Rodefeld, Director of Rural GME Development and Support for the Wisconsin Collaborative for Rural GME. We'll be discussing rural training programs, why applicants should consider them, and the broader importance of rural programs in medicine. Lori, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah, excited to have you here. And so can you start by telling us about yourself and your journey to and within GME?
Thank you, Jason, for having me. As you mentioned, I'm with the Wisconsin Collaborative for Rural GME. So we're a statewide organization that works with rural residency programs and urban programs looking to create rural rotations, rural experiences for their urban residents. And in addition to that work, I also spend half my time working with a rural residency program at Monroe Hospital in Monroe, Wisconsin. So I fell into GME 10 years ago when I was working in higher education. I kind of developed a love for developing new programs. I was working at a two-year college at the time and helped develop a lab tech program. I helped to develop an agribusiness program and just worked to support development of rural programs within our two-year campus. And then this opportunity to join a rural hospital and create a rural residency program presented itself, and I took the opportunity and ran with it. I knew nothing about residency training. I knew nothing about medical school, how long medical school was, how long residency was, but fell in love with GME and fell in love with development of new programs.
No, that's awesome. I feel like I keep starting every episode of the podcast like this. But yes, another person who just kind of fell into GME, and I think we all have in some capacity. But then once you kind of take a bite from the apple, you're hooked for the long term. So no, it's awesome, and I know we've been working together and communicating for a number of years now. So yeah, it's always just exciting for me to hear more of the story. And of course, today we're talking about rural training programs, which I think has become of big importance, both with COVID and otherwise, just in terms of underserved areas within the country, et cetera, and patient populations needing physician and other healthcare support. And so, yeah, to start, can you help us best define what a rural training program is for the various GME stakeholders that are listening to
Yes,
this?
and rural programs are all look different. Sometimes you'll hear the saying that if you've seen one rural training program, you've seen one rural training program. And I think that that's true for any GME, really. But with rural programs, there's lots of different ways you can create a high quality experience. So the traditional model is like the 1+2 in family medicine, where you'll spend 1 year at an urban residency and then 2 years at a rural site. I'd say the majority of family medicine residencies are structured that way. There is more the integrated approach within family medicine where, the resident may spend all 3 years at the rural hospital and then go out for rotations and experiences that the rural hospital can't provide. So they may have limited OB, they may have, they don't have a NICU, they may not have open heart surgery, those types of things. So that's where an urban partner can really help that rural hospital create a high quality training experience. And then in specialties, it looks completely different. It could be 8 weeks in a rural site, spread out over like 4 years of psych or 4 years of or 5 years of surgery, 4 years of OB-GYN. They'll spend time at the rural sites, but because of the procedural requirements and volumes, they'll typically spend more time at the urban location. But with the new consolidated appropriations rule changes, they actually need to spend 51% of their time at the rural site to be eligible for like a cap increase or a funding increase. So that's kind of exciting that we have more specialty programs that are interested in rural, and now there's pathways for them to kind of achieve that goal. So it's definitely been fun to see the growth of rural GME since I've been involved in GME myself. When we started our rural program, there were maybe 30 to 35 programs throughout the country, and now for family medicine that's doubled, and now we're seeing growing interest with the specialties in training rural physicians as well.
I find it fascinating, and I've studied this space for quite a while, and I learn something new every day. And we work with a number of rural training programs, yours being one of them. But yeah, there is so much diversity within GME and the types of training environments that residents and fellows and otherwise can get training in. And I just think it's I don't think it's necessarily clear to applicants as well, and certainly kind of taking a step back to sort of the broader picture. Can you discuss some of the current challenges with rural medicine that we're seeing here in the US today?
Well, I think a lot of rural hospitals are experience a lot of what urban hospitals have been facing, just from the pandemic, just being at very high census, seeing record numbers of patients. But then, when you throw in the rural factor, they have fewer staff, fewer resources, and then, just not being able to transfer out patients, it just causes a lot of stress on the staff. And I think that workforce is probably the number one issue with rural healthcare, being able to recruit not only physicians but nurses, lab techs, people who serve us food and clean our hospitals. There's just not enough of them, and then that in turn I think leads to increased stress on the healthcare system. But workforce is definitely probably the number one priority that I see, is just getting the workers that we need, especially in rural communities. And I think it's different in a rural setting. If you lose four family physicians, that could be half of your primary care department. In a rural setting, if you lose four of your primary care physicians in an urban setting, it's gonna hurt a little bit, but it doesn't hurt in the same way with regard to patient access and things like that.
Yeah, no, it's clearly a really important and big challenge in medicine, and it was challenging also even before the pandemic. I know, 'cause based on even some of the research I'd done previously with telemedicine to kind of more rural areas. And I was in upstate New York, which has some big cities and also just very rural places as well, as a lot of the states throughout the country have. And even just thinking back to when I was in medical school, and we've discussed this, just I had gone to a clinic that was run by the University of Virginia for the western part of Virginia, which is a very, very underserved, very rural area. And just the UVA brought all this doctors, dentists, and optometrists, and it was just this weekend long clinic. And you would see these people who unfortunately hadn't been able to get health care for quite a long time, and you just saw just an incredible breadth and acuity of various medical issues as well. And I just remember thinking back even then as a medical student, like, wow, there's a lot of work we need to do in this country. And so, now almost a decade later, we're on this podcast talking about this, and I think it's just I'm glad that a lot that this is coming more to the forefront. It's one of the reasons we were super excited to have you on the podcast today as well. And so, looking at all of that in perspective, why should hospital systems go about establishing rural training programs or become affiliated with one? How do they go about doing that? Even based on how does your organization help accomplish this in Wisconsin, obviously.
I think with hospitals creating rural programs, there's the value proposition. And I think that, with urban programs, it's the same thing. It's, what's the return on investment? And it's looking at, how do you, improve access for patients? How do you, recruit high quality staff without having to spend crazy amount of money? I mean, the typical cost to recruit a physician is over $100,000. And the idea that you can grow your own and pick which residents you think would be great additions to your medical staff, and then feed your healthcare system, feed your fellow rural communities with high quality doctors, that's probably the number one reason. And I think, a lot of rural communities are also looking at growth. So we have an aging population, aging baby boomers. We need to look at, like, how are we going to serve those patients, and having residents, they're a great way to see those patients, but then, it's a great way to grow your medical staff as well. We've seen great success in retaining physicians who are involved in teaching typically, are high quality physicians that you want to keep, and retain. And we've extended careers. We've had, physicians who, held off retirement because they really enjoy teaching and they really enjoy working with residents. I think that residents are great for the community. They're involved in, all kinds of community events. It's not uncommon for residents to, be out covering, high school sports games and doing athletic training, just helping support quality improvement activities at the hospital, taking the lead on some of those. And I think really just kind of giving a sense of purpose to those, attendings that they work with. And in a rural community, that's, I think, really important. And in a rural community, they may be one of, they may be like 10 to 20% of the medical staff. And I mean, that's a huge thing for a rural hospital to be able to add those people into their workforce and into the fold. And then our organization, we work with all kinds of rural hospitals. So they may have a residency program, they may be looking to be a rotation site for an urban program, and we really try to connect with them and find the best match. If they've got an enthusiastic OB-GYN who does a lot of really cool procedures, surgeries, has a lot of OB volume, they're a great site for a rural OB resident to go rotate. I was just at a rural hospital today, and someone there told me, it's a common misperception by residents that they think that rural is boring, and they're like, it's anything but boring, just because you're up doing a couple of deliveries at night, and then you're in clinic seeing patients all day and rounding on your patients, and going in for surgeries. It's a lot of variety, and I think a rural skill set is very different regardless of the specialty. You have just a different skill set that you have to develop.
No, for sure. I mean, it makes a ton of sense, and it kind of leads into my next question. Well, also in that, as an applicant, what are the top reasons you think someone would consider or should consider a rural training program?
Yeah, so I think it's the variety of the things that you get to do in any given day. I think it's interesting being in a rural program, seeing the procedures that the residents get to be a part of, whether that's inpatient procedures, whether that's outpatient procedures, the cases that they get to be a part of. It's a small camaraderie. Typically rural programs are smaller. It could be 2 residents, 3 residents, 4 residents per class, so they really get to know each other well, and they also are really well supported by faculty. A resident is off for the day, you notice if they're tired, you notice if they need fatigue mitigation, where in a larger program it's just harder to notice those little things that residents may need. And I think that it's easier to take care of your residents when you have a good pulse of what's happening, and the support that they need. The opportunity to be involved in the community is huge. To be able to go on the local radio station or go talk at the senior center, to be able to really make a difference in the community. One of my residents was on a community medicine rotation. I noticed that our local free dental clinic needed a blood pressure cuff, and he helped make the blood pressure screening happen for that like free dental clinic. And again, it was just because he had been on that rotation and had noticed that there was this need in the community, and something so simple like made such a difference for that free dental clinic. And it was because the resident noticed, hey, you're not doing any blood pressure screening here, how can we help? And again, I think that when you're in that smaller rural community, you have that opportunity to make those little changes that really make a big difference.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting to point out as a former applicant myself. I think it's really just interesting to consider training in a program like that. I think at the end of the day, a lot of people go into medicine to help people for one way or another, and a lot of the burnout is coming from documentation and processes and structures and bureaucracy. And then, yeah, based on what a lot you're describing, it sounds in many ways ideal. Like you get to make an impact in people's lives. You get to see that impact. You get to see the impact on the community. You get to be a part of the community, and you're a big fish in a small pond. It sounds like, which can be certainly very attractive. And I know that we help guide applicants in a lot of different ways, and a lot ask us, well, what kind of programs should I consider? And the feedback I always give is the ACGME credits programs, using the same guidelines in most places. You're going to get a good clinical education no matter where you end up. It's about finding the right environment and the right institution and the right culture that's right for you. I think it's hard to identify that given a lot of the data that's currently out there, but certainly going along the interview trail and researching things, and hopefully podcasts like this and discussions and social media and otherwise can help sort of expand those messages. But yeah, at the end of the day, what are you looking for as an applicant? It's a very different practice environment being at a big academic medical center where you have PAs, NPs, fellows, depending on who's staffing ICUs and who's involved where and who runs ORs and what goes on in these larger centers versus a rural program, which can in some ways have just as high an acuity in many instances, depending on the coverage area that that particular program and or institution has. And so it just leads to a much bigger, broader opportunity amongst a variety of programs that, of course, everyone's going through the match, etc. But there's a lot more, and I tell this to applicants all the time, than perceived rankings of programs or this idea of prestige and what prestige means. Because at the end of the day, you have to practice as a physician in the environment and with the patient population that you want to practice with, and we all have very different wants, needs, desires, and what we want to get out of our careers. And so here is just another opportunity to try something very different than practicing in a big urban center or at a big academic medical center, and or otherwise. And so I think that's super exciting. Of course, the next question then is, given the pandemic and everything switching to virtual, I would my guess would be that one of the big selling points of rural training programs is being able to be there and feel that community and feel that environment, feel that camaraderie. How do you, as an applicant, figure out if that fit is right for you in this current virtual world? Similarly, if you're a program, how do you portray that? And even what have you been doing in your programs?
Yeah, great question. I think the virtual recruitment has probably negatively impacted rural more than other areas, just because I think back to, when we had in-person interviews, one of the things that candidates would say is their favorite part of the day was the community tour. We would do a windshield tour where they could, kind of see all the fun things. We would talk about, we have a cheese days festival and how much fun that was, and the cheese tent, and just all of the opportunities in the local community, and you miss that when you're in a virtual interview. We've tried to keep elements of our kind of in-person experience, like the resident social hour, and really just connecting candidates with residents as much as possible. Because again, as a candidate, you want to talk to the residents. You want to see, like, what is this program really like? Are the residents really happy? And in a virtual environment, it is harder to assess that. But I think, if somebody is thinking about a rural residency program or rural track, if they have the opportunity to do like a rural rotation at one of the rural programs, I think that that's probably one of the best ways to get a sense of what rural is like, or even just to do a rural rotation, not even with a program, but see, is this the type of practice that you would want?
Mm,
I think, as you were talking about kind of the rural experience and how rural training really just provides endless opportunities. That's completely true. And a lot of times it's not uncommon for residents to get several central lines over the weekend when they're working in the ED. And
right.
I think urban residents, they don't get that same experience. So again, asking residents when you're interviewing, how many procedures are you doing? What kinds of procedures are you doing? What is your experience really like? Do you feel well supported? And I think really trying to ask good questions of the residents is really key in the virtual setting. I think that, researching programs, there, Rural Training Track Collaborative is a website that has all of the rural programs in the country. So it's not hard to find. You can, of course, Google rural programs, but it's really easy to see all of the programs in family medicine, general surgery, psych, OB. There's just growing numbers of rural programs, and starting there is a good way for an applicant to find the rural programs, but also seeing what does their kind of virtual presence look like. But then more importantly, just taking a chance on some programs, and setting up an interview and seeing, is this somewhere that you could see yourself, looking at what's the overall experience. And I would say, rural experience is completely different, but it's also, I think, the residents who train in rural programs, they're well prepared to go into those settings and do some really great work.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, hopefully the pandemic will only go on for so much longer. I do think there has been some benefit to virtual interviews in general, particularly from a cost and an equity perspective. But yeah, I think if my eventual suspicion is that there will be some sort of hybrid model, which I think could work very well to a rural program's recruitment process in the sense that they could screen virtually and then invite candidates who are more serious about the program to campus and then give them that experience, and also do it for a smaller, more committed sort of applicant population that's gotten to that second piece. There's a lot of the detail there that needs to be worked out. But yeah, I think and the other side, we're still seeing sort of similar usual match rates, even in sort of these virtual worlds. Of course, match day for this year is coming out. You know, match day is 10 days away as we're recording this today. But it's I don't think it's really necessarily hurt anyone. It's just changed things. And yes, I'd say there was some negative impact in the sense that there's a higher likelihood that someone has accidentally visited or purposely visited New York City or Los Angeles or Chicago or Miami, etc. But at the same time, it has made it easier for rural programs to attract candidates because they didn't have to commit necessarily to getting to that rural program. So it can work both ways. I It's not a question we've studied. I think it's an interesting one, and time will tell as to how that goes. But overall, yeah, I think it's been really interesting to watch this whole transition from in person to virtual, and now to wherever we end up in the future. But long story short, I'm excited about GME focusing on how do we promote the type of education and the type of residency or fellowship experience that our hospital puts out. And we've talked with newer programs and programs at different geographies and such. And so having rural training programs being an option is just, to me, very, very exciting, because here's another option. Here's a very different sort of residency experience. And where now that these programs are growing, and there's been a commitment to many states and legislatures and lawmakers, etc. Where do you see the role of rural training programs in terms of mitigating the pending physician shortages expected over the next 10 to 15 years? I know we're looking at hundreds of thousands of shortage of physicians, 100, 200,000, depending on what estimates you read. And so where do the rural training programs play a role in helping to mitigate that?
They play a huge role. I mean, when you look at the rural programs that we have in Wisconsin, two-thirds of our grads are practicing in rural areas, which is significantly higher than just a traditional family medicine grad, where, it's probably a third of that will go into rural practice. And in Wisconsin, we have very similar data as to what you're saying. We need 1,000 additional primary care physicians by 2035. So we have a lot of work to do, not only in Wisconsin, but nationally. I think it's really exciting. HRSA has funded a lot of rural residency program development grantees who are in the process of developing rural training programs. I think that there's a lot of good work being done. I don't know that we'll get to the point that we need to be at without significant expansion of GME slots. That's why the Consolidated Appropriations Act is huge to give those additional 1,000 positions, and having, I believe, at least 10% need to be rural. So I think that that's a huge step in the right direction. But again, more work needs to be done. There's the Rural Workforce Production Act, which we've been involved with in advocating for, because we do need additional GME positions for rural hospitals and rural programs that are looking to develop or expand. So until we get, that kind of movement underway, or, a significant effort like we have in Wisconsin, where we're really trying to grow GME. We've had significant growth, but we're still nowhere near where we need to be. So I'm hopeful, though, because again, as we've seen, just a huge growth in the number of rural programs in the last 10 years. Hopefully in 10 years, we'll double again, or we'll, see continued growth. And I think the growth in specialties is also really important. As we look at general surgery, most general surgery residents are going into fellowships and, not necessarily practicing general surgery in its traditional sense. And then even fewer are going into rural practice. So we need to see growth in some of these procedural based specialties, because, family medicine can do a lot, but they can't do everything. And then we have such huge needs in behavioral health. Hopefully, like with telemedicine and some of these other initiatives too, that will hopefully help somewhat, but again, we need a lot of positions with GME, especially as we're seeing medical school growth all across the country. It's not just rural. We need GME growth in general, but rural, there's I think even a bigger need. The AMC had some data a few years back showing that only 5% of medical students were looking to practice in a rural setting, and that's I think a huge barrier for rural communities. When we have 20% of our population living in a rural community, we're just going to face significant needs. But again, that's why we need to continue to grow and even to advocate for those additional GME slots.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting because yeah, when you talk of our healthcare system as a system, that obviously implies, and just to spell it out, that one part of the system affects another part of the system. So in the sense that yeah, if more general surgery trained residents are going into fellowship, there's a positive in that they're subspecializing in a field that's almost certainly underserved because there's only so many fellowship trained physicians. But what it does is it dilutes the pool down of available general surgeons to practice general surgery, which then, if only 5% of medical students want to practice in a rural area, that would mostly be 5% of the resident workforce wanting to practice in a rural area. And then yeah, you have that misbalance of numbers. And so it falls to a lot of the research we've done in looking at how growing up in a state or going to medical school in a state increases your likelihood of matching into residency in that state, kind of piggybacking off the comment you made a little while back, in that yeah, where you go to residency ultimately can in many ways dictate where you practice from sort of a macroeconomic level. So if you look at this as an entire continuum and an entire pipeline, for looking at Wisconsin, for instance, the highest likelihood any Wisconsin program has, and we've looked at several specialties, primary care, it's kind of peds, IM, and family medicine being one of those groups. Yeah, Wisconsin residency programs, they have the highest likelihood of matching a priori Wisconsin medical students or Wisconsin residents or someone who has a tie to Wisconsin. And the further you can extend that out, that like yes, if they didn't do residency in Wisconsin, it's also a pretty high likelihood that they may end up staying in Wisconsin. Or similarly, if someone leaves Wisconsin to come become fellowship trained or otherwise, how do you get them back into Wisconsin? And every state in the country is playing these similar games. Well, they're not really games, but these similar equations, and figuring out, well, how do we maximize our physician workforce for our patient population? And it's it seems very clear that there's a lot of pipeline work that needs to be done for whatever type of diversity you need in your physician population to match your patient population, and also just to staff healthcare centers and otherwise. And then how do you achieve that strategically or otherwise at the state, legislative, institutional, residency program, medical school level? And how do you align all of these pieces? And that's where all of these challenges come in. And so I think there's a ton of opportunity. We get excited about it on our end, obviously, right? If you're coming from a large state like New York, Texas, California, you have a large population in your state, you have a large number of medical schools in the state, you have a large number of residency programs in your state, so that kind of works in your favor. But then look at a Wisconsin or a Mississippi or a North Dakota, etc., and there's only so many medical schools and residency or GME academic medical centers in that state. And so there now the equation flips the other way. And so no, it's super exciting, and I'm so glad you're able to come on today to talk about this, because it seems like your organization is doing really a lot of great work for a really big need. 20% of our population is in rural areas. That's 300 million. That's 60 million people. That's a lot. It's more than 60 million because our population's above 300 now. So yeah, that's a lot of people who need healthcare. And um, having lived mostly in either suburban or major metropolitan areas my whole life, like there are many hospitals within 5 to 10 minutes of where I live, and that's very different than many other areas. And so yeah, it's just fascinating. So anything else you'd like to say about rural training programs that we haven't covered yet?
I think it's just, if hospitals programs are looking to establish rural programs, there's a lot of really great resources. There's a lot of really great support. And I would say, look at that directory on the RTT Collaborative website. All of the rural programs are super helpful. We don't have enough rural programs and enough positions currently. So if a hospital is looking to expand, we're happy to help at WCRGME. Even if you're not in Wisconsin, we'll get you connected with the right people so that you can hopefully get started. But I would say definitely look into it. I think with the Consolidated Appropriations Act, we have huge opportunities to grow rural GME, especially with the specialty areas, which is probably our biggest opportunity. We've done a lot of great work with Family Med, but it would be so awesome to see more rural OB-GYN programs, rural psych programs, rural general surgery programs. We have such a need in all of our rural communities, whether they're in Wisconsin, whether they're in the Midwest, or wherever they are in the country. And it's a friendly community. We're all willing to help. We want to see the movement grow. So definitely reach out. And if you're an applicant, definitely check out the rural programs. There's so much out there, so many great programs, and it's just I think, a unique place to train, because I think you do get to practice your specialty to kind of its fullest scope. If you're family medicine, you're not just referring patients, you're doing procedures in clinic. You may have an opportunity to work in an emergency department. You may be able to deliver babies, work in a hospital setting. You really get a chance to kind of maximize your practice and be the doctor that your community needs. So I think that if you really want to embrace that generalist role and really practice at the top of your game, rural training is definitely the way to go.
Yeah, no, I mean, I concur. We love working with the rural programs, yours included, that we work with here. And yeah, there's seems like many different opportunities out there. So for applicants, yeah, a lot of things to consider in where you practice. And I would strongly encourage everyone to check out rural training programs as well. I think it's going to be a big need for our country and our patient populations and just U.S. healthcare going forward. So awesome. We tend to ask this as everyone to kind of wrap up the podcast, but have you adopted any new hobbies during the pandemic?
Yes, I actually have gotten into hiking. My husband's been a hiker for a long time, and I had never, really embraced it. And it's something that, when you don't have as many options and things to do, taking up hiking has been really fun. So we have some good hiking here in Wisconsin, but we've also went up to northern Michigan. There's some amazing hiking there, and then we actually went out to Glacier National Park last summer, and that's probably my favorite place on earth. It's just amazing. But yeah, hiking has probably been my fun new hobby that I've acquired during the pandemic, and it's been a good one. It really ties well with my love for rural, because these are all very rural areas.
I was gonna say the hobby ties in well with the rest of the podcast, so that works out great. Also, that's awesome. Yeah, no, it's I've never been much of a hiker, but certainly have taken up some hiking over the pandemic as well, just because it's an activity that everyone can get accomplished. And being around the Nashville area, there's a lot of good hiking as well now too. So awesome. Well, Lori, this has been a real pleasure. As I said, I learn something new in GME every day, and today is no exception. And I think just the more I learn about rural training programs, the more excited I get about them, especially with the impact that trainees can make in training, after training, and otherwise in the lives of patients. And I think that's why a lot of us do what we do, and just really excited for the future. And we appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, Jason.